Episode 8 of the Music for Ministry podcast.
Welcome to the Music for Ministry podcast, providing an in-depth look at the ministry of music through the lives of music leaders today.
Hello, and welcome to the Music for Ministry podcast. I'm your host, David West, and this is the podcast for those who are passionate about ministering with music. I'm excited about today's episode because I ran into a friend of mine, David E. Smith, at the Wilds Music Conference. He and I had a chance to sit down and chat about music publishing, especially in the area of sacred instrumental music. If you don't know who David is the founder and owner of David E. Smith Publications, and his company offers a huge selection of sacred instrumental music. But before we get to our interview today, listen to this valuable musical resource.
Check out this week's valuable musical resource.
One of the blessings of going to church is being able to sing the great hymns of the faith. In fact, D.L. Moody made the comment that one of the most important books next to the Bible was the hymn book. I've always enjoyed the stories behind the great hymns and often used them as illustrations. One of the largest books on hymn histories is a book called Revive Us Again, written by Douglas Snow. He spent over 25 years compiling this work. It has over 800 pages and includes 366 of the most well-known gospel hymns. What makes this book unique is that it's a chronological anthology of American gospel hymnody, which means they are arranged in the order that they became available to our American hymn books. The way the book is laid out, it could also be a great supplement to your daily devotions. The book has so much detail about the hymns and the hymn writers. It's a great resource and would be a great addition to your library. I'll put a link to it on our site. Now let's get right into our interview. We're here today with David E. Smith from David E. Smith Publications. He's been publishing for many years and has a unique story to tell us about why be a music publisher. It's good to have you today, David.
Thank you, David. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, two Davids are here to talk about publishing. Is it a ministry or a business, an art or a passion? And I think you are qualified to share a little bit of information about the experiences as a publisher over the years and, maybe some of the pitfalls of being a publisher as well as some of the successes that you've experienced or seen in other companies. So let's go back to the beginning when you first thought about the publishing business and give us an idea of what gave you a desire to publish.
Well, I started out as a kid in school, not having things to play. My father wanted me to play an instrument when I was young, and I said, okay. And he said, what instrument would you like to play? And I said, I don't know. And he said, well, why don't you try the trumpet? That's a good church instrument. And so I started, and as I went along and developed a bit and wanted to play in church, I found virtually nothing. Now, this is going back in the 1950s. And probably the first book I ever had was a Lilliness publication, which was essentially about a dozen songs that you would find in a hymn book that had a transposed trumpet line. And that was about it. And if you went to a store, you almost found nothing at that time. And so that's what started the whole thing out. I always had an interest and then started doing some writing even when I was in high school. Then I went on to college and started honing some skills. But as I was going along in my teaching career and listening to people needing literature for church and Christian schools and whatnot, I realized there was a real dearth of materials. And so I started out with some of my own arrangements and a few others, went around from place to place with my two little 2-inch binders showing my wares. And from those early days, back in about the early 1980s, and to what we have today in the publishing world is quite different. A lot of publishers out there. producing a lot of materials, but that wasn't the case 30 years ago. So it was kind of a forerunner as far as instrumental, and that's what my whole emphasis is instrumental. I thought people have choral literature. There's always been piano arrangements, but when it came to wind and string material, you didn't really find that much, or at least I didn't find that much. And so I started out with those first 20 or 30 pieces.
That's good. There is a need to have quality instrumental and sacred instrumental music available. I remember as a young musician as well, the same problem, playing an instrument and not having resources to find. And it's been the same in the choral. I know the market's plentiful now as far as our choices. Your publishing company has grown over the years, and you have many different publishing companies that have joined in with yours. You're like the umbrella for many other groups. Can you explain what you do there as far as being a distributor?
Sure. Well, we now have, as far as companies of our own, we've acquired a few others. So our brand names under our umbrella is David E. Smith Publications, Psalm 150 Publications, Majestic Music Publications, and Riversong Productions. So those are our entities. Then we act as a distributor as well. And it's interesting that the good Lord kind of gave me that direction when I first started to be a three-pronged entity, and that would be a publisher, the ones I just mentioned, and then to also be a distributor. And I've had other ones kind of come and go. But also we carry Rich Heffler Music, Stockton Music Services, Light of the World Music, and Ken Bauer Productions. So those are the companies we're exclusively distributing. And then the third prong is to be a dealer. And so we act as a dealer for probably 20 or more companies. And so you put all of that together, and we catalog well over 6,000 items now.
Wow. How do you sell it, or how do you provide it to the churches or to the general public?
That's multifaceted as well. I've always worked hard at working through dealerships. And music dealers have really come under a lot of pressure economically and logistically in the last several years. And so I find that kind of faltering, unfortunately. The fortunate part for us is we still work through dealers, the major ones, and those are very helpful. We work through conferences, at exhibits, and mail order, and more recently, within the last 10 years or so, through our websites. And we have 3 websites, and that gets the word out. It does take a lot of advertising. We've kind of diminished that recently, and we've kind of felt that. And not having the support of a lot of dealer activity, that's made quite a difference. But over the years, we have sold music in every state and province of North America and about 25 foreign countries, and we've got dealerships in just about every state in the Union, and some in Canada and even other countries.
Well, can you explain to us a little bit about what goes into being a publisher, as far as how multifaceted it is to publish a piece of music?
Well, there's a lot to it. With the entities we have now, we probably have well over 100 writers. Some companies and even the major publishers have their own stable of writers, and so quite often, if you're not in that stable, you don't get in the front door. Right. And that's been one of the things that from almost day one that I felt was a mission, was to give opportunities to people who had abilities and wanted to serve the Lord with their music, to give them a source to be published. And that's probably one reason we have over 100 writers now, as opposed to just being a one-writer publisher or a 6-writer publisher or that type of thing. We have certain guidelines. Obviously, my musical background, I'm sure, governs a lot of what we pick. When I get submissions in from writers, the first thing I probably look for is counterpoint. If it's just a transposed thing out of the hymn book, it's probably not going to make it. I think that's one thing that makes a difference between instrumental music and vocal music. We're not dealing with text per se, and so we have to have things in of interest musically that makes the music interesting and carries a message along with it. So we have to do things musically and texturally since we're not dealing with text of lyrics.
Well, music can be very expensive, and a lot of times we'll hear people complaining about the price of buying a solo piece. They can buy it as a solo or buy it in a collection. What justifies the price that, or the premium sometimes people have to pay for sheet music these days?
Yeah, it's interesting because people will talk about that, and yet statistics will bear out that the price of music really isn't too much different than it was decades ago. I mean, you go try to buy a car today for what you would have bought one 30 years ago. Buy a piece of music compared to what you would have paid for it 30 years ago. Not too much difference. But people, I think sometimes, particularly in the church world, because we're dealing with ministry and stewardship, really want it pretty close to free. The other thing that we're facing too that is different compared to the past is downloading music. And we're starting to do that through several different entities as well. So people do look at the cost of it, but while the price of reproducing equipment and everything that goes into making music keeps going up, the price of the final product really has not changed that much. In fact, in some cases, on certain types of items, it's probably come down.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned submissions. Are you still receiving submissions, or
Yes, I get them all the time, literally from all over the world. And when people submit things to me, I always throw out the caveat that I'm always behind, way behind in reviewing. And part of the reason that is not only because of the amount of materials we get in, but I always want to give a piece a really good shot of consideration. And so I will tend to sit on it for a while, and then that obviously becomes kind of a slowdown, and then it takes longer than I would really like. But on our despub.com website, in the tab About Us, there is a whole outline of how to submit to us. And the interesting thing is, as it relates to developing a catalog, I've had pieces that I have rejected, and then only to 2 or 3 years later turn around and accept that same piece that a person has submitted again because our catalog has changed. And so even on our submission form, we state it's not always just the quality of the music, it's how it fits into the overall nature of our catalog.
And our topic of conversation is why be a music publisher. Is this a get-rich-quick type of business, or is it something that takes a lot of time?
Yeah, I don't think it's a get-rich-quick or even a get-rich-ever type of thing. And as I stated earlier, I think particularly in the church world, in the conservative church world, where people are very concerned about their stewardship, they're probably pickier than other parts of the industry. I don't think the pop music faces that. It's almost like there are people want a piece of music, they'll spend whatever they want. And I've seen people at an exhibit, for example, that will come back and look at a piece again and again and again and again, just to make sure if the music is correct and whether they want to spend that $3 for that solo or not. So, there's a lot of discretion that goes in on the end user as to what they're going to accept.
All right. Well, take us through, if someone were to submit something to you and you did accept it, how does the writer benefit from publishing through a publishing house such as yours?
Well, exposure. We get people sometimes that want us to be their distributor, and they maybe have their 3 or 4 little pieces, and they know they need to get the word out there somewhere. Most of the companies that we deal with, as far as distribution, you're going to have anywhere from 1 to 500 pieces of music, and so that tends to be somewhat a bit of a qualifier. I did a multi-section set of articles in our company newsletter, which is Lines and Spaces, a few years ago, and I went through the step-by-step process there, and you can find those articles on despub.com in the newsletter section. And when it comes to the submission, the reviewing of that. Sometimes we field test a piece of music before we consider it. We go back and re-edit it, or ask the writer to re-edit their piece. Maybe there's things that are of concern to us. Then you go into the production of it. Then you're dealing with advertising, marketing, whether it's to individuals or dealers or whatever. And so the process just goes on and on and on. And that's partly what you have to figure in to the pricing aspect of it, even as it relates to royalties. And then if the writer used a piece of music that's not public domain, we have to kind of figure, is it worth going into getting a license from the original publisher to use that piece? How much more do we have to tack on to the list price to cover those royalties, not to just the writer, but also to the original copyright holder? And so all of these things, go into the process. And sometimes we have to do research as to whether it's going to be a violation of a copyright. And so, there's time that's spent in doing that whole process. So there's a lot of things that go into it. And then with instrumental music, we're very much interested in leveling. Unlike some catalogs, a lot of catalogs, whether they're major secular catalogs or major sacred ones, tend to kind of publish down the middle, if you will, like the easy level 3s. Which makes a lot of sense from the standpoint of marketing and sales and whatnot. I've probably taken the hard way through all of this, because we will publish for most every instrument, solo and or ensemble, anywhere from level 1 on up through 5 or 6. And so that really spreads the whole thing out. And that's probably one reason we have a pretty good sized catalog, and makes it a little more difficult as far as people knowing what we have, because we haven't just taken that one level and kind of stayed there, which publishers will tend to do over the years.
I'm sure that every publisher is concerned about copyright infringements and things like that. And sometimes the view of our churches or ministries is that if it's used for the Lord's work, then we can treat it a little bit differently.
Amen, brother.
Can you explain the scenarios of maybe a comparison of what that is and what it's not to the purchaser?
Well, it's interesting how people will be so sensitive about real property. Most people wouldn't go out and just open up somebody's car and drive away with it, because that would be theft, But with copyright law and intellectual property, they don't seem to either understand it or value it. And so if we use a piece of music for the Lord's work, why do we have to monkey around with all this law stuff? So there are copyright laws in our country. Our founding fathers put that in our Constitution. We're one of the few countries that ever had that. And they wanted to view and protect the work of artists so they would continue to perpetuate more things. And sometimes when people are breaking copyright law, it's not just a matter of breaking the principles of the law, but it doesn't give an awful lot of incentive for a writer or a publisher to put out their materials if people are just going to use it at will. The other part I think is very much misunderstood is what is called fair use in the copyright law. And there are places where use can be made as far as like photocopying or whatnot, particularly with libraries and in schools. But even there's restrictions. And most people will just say, the copyright law says we can make fair use of making a copy, and not realizing that most of that is really for archiving of libraries and whatnot. So it's not quite as open-ended as people would think. And then not every country has a copyright law, or what we call members of the Berne Convention. And so while we have fairly strict copyright laws, other countries may not have that at all. And if we market our things to another country that doesn't have that, people could be photocopying there and not really in violation, at least in their laws of their country.
So let's say I'm a church musician and I decide to possibly record something to give to our congregation, or maybe even to put it on a CD and sell. Mm-hmm. I know there are several different types of licenses.
That's correct.
And could you explain what the different types of licenses that you issue so that people can treat the copyright properly? When
I first started publishing, my main concern as far as contracts was royalty contracts to the writers. And then I started getting requests from people who wanted to make CDs or whatnot, and those are called mechanical licenses. And so that's about the only kind of license I dealt with for a lot of years until I had people who were using our publications in their services that maybe were being transmitted over radio or television. So then we had to deal with synchronization licenses that we would grant. And then more recently, our digital transmissions that people will use of music. And so we have to grant digital contract licenses. So it's getting, as technology changes, it's getting more complex all the time.
On your website, you mentioned you can buy the physical copy, or you can get a digital download of that product through Sheet Music Plus or some of those companies.
Yeah, or Pepper or SacredSheetMusic.com and some of those. Yeah, we're working with several vendors. We don't do that personally on our own site, but we are working with other companies who are that deal with that technology. And one of the things that relates to copyright, we tend to be pretty gracious on giving permissions to copy. So if a person wants to copy something and needs additional copies or wants to edit or those type of things, to keep in line with the copyright law, they really need to get a permission to copy. Some companies are very tough about that and tend not to grant them easily. We tend to most always grant them. And also stating the appreciation that people are following the copyright law and doing so.
Well, that's good. Tell me a little bit about your philosophy. You mentioned to me earlier about your axiom of publishing. What is that about?
Oh, yeah. Well, I started out many years ago and saying I had two axioms of publishing music. And the first one was, we don't have what you want. And the second one was, if we do have it, it's not the way we would like it. Until one of my friends said, but Dave, you forgot the third axiom. And I said, oh, what's that? He says, I wanted it yesterday. So that's the problem. I can remember many years ago here at the Wilds that we had a publisher's session, and a lot of conversation was going on, and one of the publishers said that they had well, the question was thrown out, what type of things would you like? And so the people in the seminar were giving ideas of things that they would like. And so one of the publishers said, well, they followed up on that one time. They had a very good selling octavo, and people were wanting orchestrations of it, or maybe it was a musical. And so they put all the time and money and engraving and everything to this orchestration to accompany the musical, granting the wishes of what their customers really wanted, and then proceeded within the next 2 years to sell 3 copies. So I find in talking to most publishers, people will really say what it is they want, but carrying through with the purchase of, use and proper use of that sometimes doesn't happen, So you're all the time having to second guess, the market. You got to be ahead of them to produce things that they don't even realize yet that they know they might want, and then to try to meet the things that they say they want, but don't always carry through with, and then you're sitting there with a lot of inventory.
Right. And so you might have even a solo piece for oboe, and someone likes it, but they don't play the oboe. They play another instrument. They may contact you and say, could I have it for French horn or something like that?
Yeah.
And you would be able to do that through your services.
Yes. We have tended over the years to maybe be a little more musically pure than some companies. Sometimes we will publish a piece for every instrument, and some companies do that all the time. I tend to publish things that follow a kind of a generic line. For example, if we have a woodwind solo that comes out, we may publish it for different woodwind solos, but we probably won't do it for brass or other things that don't fit. And conversely, with a brass piece or a string thing. So we don't just kind of pump the piece into every idiom. So we do carry some guidelines there. Different publishers will handle that different ways.
And some keys won't work for certain instruments.
Oh, yes. I just had someone at the booth last night was looking at some string things, and they wanted to know about the keys. They weren't all that familiar with it. And they said, I see this has sharps, and they were a flutist. And I said, well, string people don't like flats. and conversely, wind people don't like sharps, And so we have some things that we've published for different instruments, different idioms, and we've even spent the time and the money and put them in totally different keys. These days, that's easier with computer generating things. We do most everything on Finale in-house. But when I first started publishing, I was using acetate rub-ons on manuscript paper, and then I was, like most publishers back 3 decades ago, we were producing our music with manual music typewriters.
Right.
And that's just the way it was done. And so every time you would put a piece of music out for different instruments, you had to really think carefully about it, because it's not like today where you just push the button in the program and get a new key and away you go. Another part of that, we've gotten pretty detailed on our string things. I have a gal that does editing for us, and sometimes writers might have good arrangements, but they may not understand string technique. And she will go in and work on bowings and fingerings and all of those type of things to make a really good addition out of it. And even to the point we're now going back to older pieces that we've had on the market for some time and redoing those.
That's good.
Particularly for younger things, younger students, it's very helpful to them. I find professionals will say, don't put all that in, we'll do it our own way. But for younger players, that's very helpful to have that information.
Just a couple more questions. Tell us about the flagship product that really has helped your company over the years. I know you've had several instrumental series that you've sold quite a few of. Have been
Sure.
very popular in Christian schools.
Right.
For groups that had maybe less than adequate instrumentations. What
Right.
are those products about?
Okay. As you observe the publishing field, and I've noticed this for years, most every publisher will have something that keeps them alive, so to speak. And it's the same with us. Probably what we call the big three, and they are the hymn ensembles, which are like mix and match instrumentations, or be like for bands and orchestra. And if you don't have optimum instrumentation, there's enough cross-cueing and writing and parts that you can make them work. Something that's even more functional, but a little more block and stock, is what we call the hymns for multiple instruments. Those two series alone have been very beneficial to us. In sacred instrumental music, I think sometimes if you sell 500 to 1,000 of something, you've probably done pretty well. So a little different in the vocal field or even keyboard. But with instrumental, those numbers are pretty exciting. But in those two titles alone, in the 6 volumes that are in there, the last time I calculated, we've sold probably more than 35,000 units. The third part or prong of that big three is Heritage, which is a band method supplement using all sacred instrumental music. We've got another series that's just coming out in the next few months, a whole different ilk than sacred music, but we've had Christian schools that are wanting things for activity bands or pep bands and that type of things. And a lot of the items that are out there by major publishers are not the type of music that most of those institutions want to use. So we've come up with a book, Pep Ensembles, that's the working name, that can be used for these school groups where they can have a lot of fun with their different activities and yet use music that would probably be conducive to their philosophies and their musical taste.
I know for concerts and for special programs, sometimes they're looking for more of a concert-type song, and the activity songs is a great idea. I'm sure it'll be very, very
Of course,
popular.
we have a full line of, like concert band and orchestra materials that we have, traditionally scored.
And you're a adjudicator, I guess is the word for it,
Right.
where you get to sit in on competitions and do some judging and critiquing.
Right. Yeah, that's not my main job in life, so I don't do a lot of it. But I have done guest conducting and adjudicating and lecturing and things in at least 15 states, so I get around from time to time, and sometimes the word spreads and I end up going to another place. Like I said, it's not my main thing because of time or emphasis, but it does happen, and is an enjoyable thing to be able to do and to help others, with that background. I was a band director for 18 years and had a successful program. And so before I started publishing, I had that kind of background and had a lot of positions in the educational field. And so now that pays off by lending that information to others who may need it.
And you're based out of Michigan.
Yes.
What part of Michigan?
We are in what is called the thumb of Michigan. Michigan's like a mitten, is obviously to the right-hand side. We're about 100 miles north of Detroit. We live in a rural community where my wife and I both taught in that area, and we've just stayed there. That is another thing that has made a difference from when I first started publishing, because I was concerned, where do I need to live and operate out of? When you got a FedEx account, a UPS account, an internet account, on and on it goes. You can be just about anywhere anymore. Mm-hmm. And so we've just stayed put and enjoy that area where we've raised our kids and continue to live.
And the last question I have for you is, if someone is interested in contacting you or finding out more about David E. Smith Publications, mm-hmm. how would they go about contacting you?
Well, we have several websites. DESPUB.com is kind of our traditional site, which is more informational. We have a marketing site, which is churchmusic.biz, B-I-Z, and that has an excellent search engine on it for locating materials, and there's contacts through that. We also have a new one, which is called musicforhomeschoolers.com, aimed at that area. We have two other alias sites, which are instrumentalchurchmusic.com and vocalchurchmusic.com. We landed those because we never know what we might do in the future, but those will tie into our other present sites. We have a toll-free number at 800-O for order, O Sacred, which is 800-672-2733. And then we have business numbers and as well as fax lines and all of those type of things. A zillion different email addresses. The main one, which is despub@greatlakes.net or info@despub.com and a lot of other ones. And then we have a lot of dealers that handle our materials, and so a lot of times we get questions or referrals even from dealers.
Well, we'll put links to all of those on our website so people can find them easily at graceforall.com/music for ministry. So thank you again for being with us, and thank you for sharing why be a music publisher.
Thank you. I've enjoyed this and sharing the experience I've had over the last few decades.
All right. Thank you, David. This brings us to the end of the Music for Ministry podcast. You can find links and program notes to our show at graceforall.com/music for ministry. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to tell your friends about it, and do me a favor, head over to iTunes and give us a rating and give a review, and also feel free to subscribe to the podcast. Have a great day, and make music for ministry your passion too.
The Music for Ministry podcast is a production of Grace for All Publications.